Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we have a very special, very interesting guest. My mom is going to be here today, and we are going to talk about every presidential election she has voted in from 1976 to 2020. And we're going to kind of do a tour of the last 50 years of American presidential politics. And we touch on economics and the media and institutions and generational differences and all this type of thing. And so it's a really interesting conversation, and I've never had my mom on the podcast before or this close to this and what I do in my work and all this type of thing. So it's a very interesting conversation. It was supposed to be an hour. We talked for two. We kind of go through each election sequentially and talk about the politics of the time. So starting with Jimmy Carter and going straight through to Trump. And we talk about her vote for Trump and her issues with Democrats and all this sort of thing. So it's a very interesting sort of conversation, and it's definitely worth listening to. So strap in, everybody. This is the Cameron Journal podcast with my mom. Let's go. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. And it's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are going to demonstrate why parents should not let their children grow up to be social media influencers or political commentators. Because if you let them grow up to be social media influencers or political commentators, you will get drafted into being on their podcast. And the test subject we have today to prove this fact about life is my mom. So welcome, Mom, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. So I got this idea because Mike MGTV had his mom on his YouTube channel, and other YouTubers do that. And I thought, I have a mom. I could have her on the podcast. This could be interesting. So,
yes.
So the first thing I wanted to talk about was a couple months ago, I think when I was there last year and I was hanging out during the pandemic, we talked about votes for president. And I was surprised at how many third-party candidates you voted for.
Yes, I vote what I support, not necessarily what the crowd thinks is the best. I want to support the candidates that most are similar to what I believe in.
Right. So your first presidential election was 1970.
Would be 74.
Right, but we didn't have a presidential in 74. We had a presidential in 76. So your first competition was Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter.
Yeah. Neither one of them was a great choice. Yeah.
So who did you vote for in 76?
In 76, I actually did vote for Gerald Ford. Jimmy Carter was a compromise candidate for the Democrats and pretty weak one at that. So
yeah, nobody had heard of Jimmy Carter before like the DNC convention in 76. Like
nope.
He was governor of Georgia and was like, nobody knew who he was.
Nope, and he'd not made a particular splash anywhere else either. And so when they brought him out as their compromise candidates, one went and researched what he did as a governor, and it wasn't particularly impressive, and his presidency reflected that.
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought about the picture with Biden and Jimmy Carter. I thought it was like not great messaging because it's like, but Mr. Biden, we're having stagflation, there are gas shortages, and we're having inflation and high unemployment. Like, maybe don't remind everybody about the Carter years. Like, this is not the time to remind everybody about the late 70s, which weren't great.
Like,
Well,
I thought that
it's
was a weird choice considering what's going on in the country right now.
Yep, it's when you talk about what's going on right now, you've got the 1970 clothes coming back, and now you've got another 1970s president and administration in the Biden administration. And that doesn't, in my view, bode well for the country, because it didn't do well when it happened in the 70s. And I just can't imagine that it's going to do much better now. I could be surprised, but it's unlikely.
Yeah, one of the things I was surprised about that while we're stuck in the 70s is when last year I did a two-part episode on the podcast about the presidency. And I put together all these different clips of presidential speeches, including the oldest known recording of a president, Chester Arthur. And I finally had a chance to listen to the Jimmy Carter malaise speech because I was looking for a quote to put in the podcast. And I was surprised at how he's just kind of like, things are bad, it's bad out there, but didn't offer like any solutions, any hope. Like, it was just kind of like, everything's bad, everybody. Don't know what we're going to do about that, but it's not great out there. Like, at the time, how did that feel?
Me, I was, I couldn't get a job. The gas lines were long. For me, it was disheartening.
You were in Colorado at that time, right?
Yes, partly.
Or were you out in Vegas?
Not. I was in Vegas for most of it,
yeah.
Which, in Las Vegas, you had gas lines. People couldn't drive across the desert to get to Las Vegas from California because of the limitations with fuel, the even odds. And one of the big things in Vegas was the casinos offered gas coupons to their favorite gas stations, so that if you came and stayed there and you gambled X amount of dollars, they actually gifted you a gift card to a gas station to fill you up so you could go back home. And that, was, and when you lived there in town, you had to plan, for how to get to work and spending time to get fuel. It was hard. And Jimmy Carter didn't choose to try to do anything about the fuel shortages. He allowed the embargo to occur. He also had the hostages taken. He was treated with pretty much total contempt by a good portion of the world. And he did not, nor did his administration, because I can't say it's just him. It was his administration as well, did nothing to combat that. And for the most part, his administration was pretty ineffective, and it affected everyone around. And it was not surprising that he was a one-term president because of the fact that he lacked strong leadership.
I always thought it was an odd thing to keep Henry Kissinger around, considering the way Kissinger basically let OPEC strangle the West.
I think in some regards, you have to look at Kissinger as one of the first, if you want to call it this, climate change crazies, for lack of a better word. Yeah. He did not feel that the country should have oil. He didn't think that there should be all that cars. He didn't like gas guzzlers. That's when you started getting, all these little cars, because, like the Ford Pinto, the crazy crash blow up kind of Pinto, that and Mavericks, that was auto companies' first strides into low or fuel efficient cars, because Henry Kissinger did not feel like, for whatever reason, that he wanted to go up against OPEC. This was the Middle East coming together and finally taking a stand against the oil companies in the United States. But at the same time, the oil companies weren't encouraged to drill in the United States, and the consumer suffered.
Yeah, I mean, and especially I think one of the things that I think is also odd about like the oil embargo and kind of what happened to the American auto industry at the same time is not only did we have the oil embargo, but then we also, and this was a Nixon thing, put in a bunch of really kind of punishing smog regulations that automakers were totally unprepared for, while at the same time increasing the safety standards for cars, thereby making them heavier. So it's like we're asking car companies to do multiple things at once. It's like we want cars to be much safer, we want them to be much more fuel efficient, and we want them to produce less pollution. Do all of those things at the same time and do them by the next model year.
Yep.
Like
And
that's not like from an engineering perspective, that's not really possible. And it wasn't, and foreign competition ate the American company's lunch.
oh, completely. Toyota came along and took right on over. Anybody that could at that time was getting a Toyota Corolla or a Camry. They were all about the Toyotas. And even now today, you'll still see some of the little older Toyota trucks, the little trucks still running around that was fuel efficient, and you were still able to haul stuff around. Again, if you had a large family, you weren't going to be able to go anywhere in it, because that was at the same time when they instituted the safety standards of you can't ride in the back of a pickup truck anymore. So people with families all of a sudden came up against this wall of we can't all go someplace together, because now the station wagons were going out. And so this vehicle problem became a real problem. Even in our family, when we were here in Colorado, we had a Chevy station wagon that all of us could go in, but at the same time we had a Pinto, so that some of us could go.
Wasn't that the car that Grandma was driving on the highway and the hood flew up?
Yes, it was.
And she decided it was time for a new car.
Well, it was a Pinto. It got, remember, it was being driven by 5 people. I'm amazed the little car lasted as long as it did.
Right.
It actually lasted a good long while, and I am impressed at how long it did last for as many miles that was on it. But again, this was, the imposition of, with the embargo, this was a big Democrat opportunity to start implementing policies and regulations that they wanted. And as one of the previous administrations said, never let a crisis go to waste. And that's the one thing that the Democrat Party and not Biden, but the Carter administration managed to not miss out on, was implementing those new regulations, which, you're right, changed the whole auto industry, but it wasn't for the good at the time.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that like especially in like car circles, we all talk about how crappy early smog cars were, and everybody wonders like how the Japanese were able to do it. And it's the solution is actually really simple. Japan had implemented smog and safety regulations about 10 years before. So all the big Japanese manufacturers had a full decade to perfect more efficient engines, all this type of thing. And so by the time they really started exporting cars to the US, they already were smog compliant. They already had a lot of safety things in place. And so it was an easy thing to do. Whereas the big 3 were basically having to do all of that all at once. And then lo and behold, in the 80s, American companies caught up, but by then it was too late. Consumer habits had changed. And It didn't really necessarily matter by that time.
Yes, that is true. And there was a lot of hard feelings caused over that within the American population, because, for better or worse, Americans love their cars. And if you go to any auto auction, you can see that now. They love their muscle cars. They love the look of the cars. And the Carter administration,
you needn't go to an auction.
Look
at any of the big 3 and how all the new cars are modern retakes of old styles.
Yeah, a little bit. They're not quite as flamboyant as the older versions because of the aerodynamics issue that everyone talks about. I mean, you take a Cadillac today and look at a Cadillac from the 1950s and 60s, and they are very different. You don't have.
Oh no, they don't. They can't. I mean, they can't build Cadillacs the way those cars were huge. My art mentor, Jesse Jacob, had a 59 DeVille sedan. The car was massive, 109-inch wheelbase. I mean, the car was huge.
But think of the tail fins and stuff. Those were fashion statements that people liked. And you were able to identify a Lincoln from a Cadillac because of the body style. Today,
those cars also got 10 miles to the gallon.
Yep. But fuel at that time was cheap too. And that was another issue with the embargo and the Carter administration, was that, you went from 10 to 25 cents a gallon, all of a sudden up to, $2 a gallon, and having to wait in line to get your 10 gallons.
Right.
And, and to some degree, reflecting back on it, I believe the Carter administration could have done better with that. But again, it was an opportunity for them to bring big change to the country. And to some degree, that's probably the one thing Carter and Biden have in common, is that their administrations want to bring about big change for them to be remembered. Unfortunately, if Mr. Biden ends up like Mr. Carter, he's going to be remembered for not good big things, but bad big things.
Yeah. So then moving into the 1980s, I imagine you voted for Reagan in 1980.
I did. Just because he promised he would bring the hostages back. The hostages was a big deal because it was being said they were going to be killed. And
hang on for a second for the listener. Mom's talking about the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the American embassy hostages, in case you're not aware of the history. Continue.
And Jimmy Carter had been pretty indifferent to them being held hostage, and the Ayatollah was pretty adamant he was going to have them killed. And Mr. Reagan, part of his platform was he would bring home the hostages. And at that time, it was a big deal. There was many of them, and it was a big deal to get them home. You were seeing about their families, and how that there was no hope. And Reagan gave people hope that he would bring the hostages home. And I voted, as one of those things. And he also indicated that he would try to make our country stronger and not be bowled over by any group, terrorist group or whomever, that wanted to bowl over the United States. And for that time period, after we'd been through the embargo and we were doing the gas lines, that was a big deal. And Jimmy Carter wasn't bringing forth anything that he was going to change for the 80s. He basically was still campaigning on the same old, same old. And that didn't appeal to a lot of people. They were tired of this, the gas shortages. They were tired of the hostage situation. And they wanted to see somebody take on the Ayatollah and to actually win. And that, I believe, was part of what brought Mr. Reagan into office. I know a lot of people point to his, taxes and, how he handled the economy. But for the near and dear, it was the hostages. That was a big deal.
Yeah, I think in terms of history, I don't think people and I'm glad you brought that up. I don't think people realize how at the time, that 1980 election, how really big that was. I mean, that was like a sort of 9/11 of its day, because that had never really happened before. It was quite a big scandal. And it really defined the whole campaign. To some degree, it was the only issue that mattered.
It was.
Weirdly enough.
Yes, it did, because people were angry about Jimmy Carter leaving the hostages there. And I think that was one of the big reasons he lost, was because he didn't take the American public sentiment about the hostages serious. And plus, this was also a time frame where every time you turned around, an airplane was being hijacked and taken off to Cuba. So this was, an issue that people understood and were fearful of, because you didn't want to get on an airplane and end up in Cuba and be there for 2 or 3 weeks because some terrorist hijacked you. So when the hostages were taken in, out of the embassy, it was again saying, we can't even come home. We can't, if they take us, we can't even come home. And I believe the Carter administration failed to address that fear in the American people.
But conversely, Carter was going for trying to negotiate with the Ayatollah and the new Iranian regime. The only option he really had was either to do some sort of daring rescue mission, which they planned and trained for, but never did, and also, or invade Iran. And I don't think there was, especially right after Vietnam, this is 4 or 5 years after the end of Vietnam, there was no will to go on another long war at the time. He was kind of, I feel like, between a rock and a hard place on that.
It's somewhat, but to be candid about Mr. Carter, he did not come across as a particularly strong and vibrant, and what I'm saying, I mean what I'm saying, and you better take me seriously kind of president. Whereas Ronald Reagan came along and, he stood strong, he stood tall, he spoke aggressively, he spoke in that firm voice of which perhaps Mr. Carter could have made a difference if he had spoken in that fashion, but he didn't. And, Ronald Reagan came along and basically made Mr. Carter look like a wimp. And I think that's how the American people seen him. And that's somewhat how I seen him, in that Ronald Reagan said what he said, and he meant what he said, and he was going to do what he said. And all Jimmy Carter was saying was not much. And during an election year, to me, you can't have that. I mean, you got to say something. You got to, be aggressive about something. And Mr. Carter wasn't even coming out and saying that I want to get the hostages back. It seemed like as the time came, he went, just got quieter and quieter, which was not good for, his campaign anyway. And I believe that didn't help him.
No, I definitely agree. So Reagan gets in 1980, voted for Reagan. 84 comes along. Reagan wins a 49 state landslide. Poor Walter Mondale.
Yep.
Sort of thing. Reagan again in 84 for you?
Yeah, I liked what he was doing at the time. The Contra thing was a problem. I didn't like that, but that didn't come out until much later. I'm still not a fan of the major the colonel rather, that pulled off that whole scheme. And
Oliver North.
Yes, there you go, Oliver North. And I was not a fan. I thought that was too much interference in South America. And I know that the claim was that we're trying to make that country better. I don't know that really was a wise decision. Considering what we have today, I think that, that maybe if they'd been a little more aggressive, maybe we wouldn't have the immigration issues coming out of South America that we have. But at the time, it became a big embarrassment for Ronald Reagan, for one of his people to have, done this, and him to most likely have endorsed it. And that came from that also time back to Nixon, of when you had a press that, definitely went looking for stuff and, got their facts and got their figures accurate and started producing information. And that brought forth the time of the whistleblowers, that, we're going to tattle on everything. The bureaucrats came to the front. We had a time when politicians led, and then after Nixon and Carter and coming into Ronald Reagan, the bureaucrats started becoming the deep throats, the whistleblowers, to get an agenda, to divide an agenda that they didn't like. And so we started seeing that with Ronald Reagan and the Contra issue. And
Conversely, the CIA was basically trading weapons and drugs to have its own funding source for its own operations. I mean, you may not like what Gary Webb did on that, but that's not great for the CIA to just kind of be like, well, you're not going to give us the money we want, so we'll get our own money. by
Right.
selling drugs and guns. Like,
Yes, and I agree. They should not have been doing that. But in some regards, I look at that and go, what's so different about them doing that as the Fast and Furious fiasco in Mexico with the guns from the Obama administration?
yes, no, I'm not. I know I'm not saying that those two things are different. I'm just saying, like, as an idea of like of like, should the media be exposing these things? Absolutely. I'm
Right.
sad that more wasn't made of Fast and Furious. I think that was quite a damning scandal because we started getting shot at with our own weapons. That's
Yep.
not good. Like,
Nope.
you know,
It's not.
sort of thing. The same thing with the whole Libya Benghazi thing. I Going after Hillary Clinton and her emails was a fool's errand. But the fact of the matter is that the way the Obama administration handled the whole Libya thing was terrible, and the country's been plunged into civil war, and we haven't lifted a finger to do anything about it.
Well, as you have
And
pointed out,
nobody makes that big a deal about that, and I think that should be a bigger deal.
yeah, but as you have pointed out in previous conversations we've had, the various branches of the United States has a tendency to meddle in countries' affairs.
Yeah.
To advantages, to not advantages, depending on which side of the situation you're on.
Mm-hmm.
The Libya thing, I agree that was way poorly handled. I think part of the problem the United States has with dealing with the Middle East is they don't understand how the tribal culture works, or the great impact their religion has on their culture.
That's so true.
The United States has a tendency to think that, if we just bring in our values, that will make them all peaceful and friendly and stuff. And they still have not learned that lesson, because, it's the friend, the enemy of my friend is, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is how that goes. They'll all squabble among themselves, but the minute an outsider comes in, they all unite and they're ready to take you on. And the US has never adjusted to that thinking. And I don't think they're ever going to. I think that is so foreign to them that somebody would not want to be a part of the Western culture, even though the Middle East culture, Middle East people come to the United States. They don't come to the United States to blend in. They come to the United States for jobs. They come to the United States for a better living. They also come to the United States to have their own culture, their own tribe, their own language. They do not choose to assimilate. They don't like American laws, and for the most part, they don't like American culture. And that is a problem with the American people's failure to understand that, and that's a problem with the American government's failure to understand that, which is why we continue to have problems in the Middle East, I think, as well as in Minnesota.
This is an area where, and we'll come back to 1988 here in a second. That's an area where in Europe it has been a long-standing political problem for about 10 years. The Syrian refugee crisis has brought it into focus, but particularly in France and elsewhere, it has been a major political thing for about 10 years of, no-go zones, how to handle public spaces. I saw a video from the German TV service, DWTV, Deutsche Welle, and they were talking about how, like, in lots of neighborhoods, especially in the suburbs of Paris, the majority of the population surrounding is Muslim. And women, even non-Muslim women, are oftentimes bullied into not being in public spaces.
Yes.
And this is completely anathema to French, to like normal modern French Western culture. And this sort of thing goes on. It's a really terrible. I mean, how long before it comes to this country?
It's already started. You look at Minneapolis, Minnesota, and you can already see what's going on.
Huge Muslim population. Yeah.
Yes, little Somalia. Yeah. They up there, they still deal with, they still do female genital mutilation. And though there's laws against it, they still do it. They as you pointed out, they still bully women. Yeah, the men are of the opinion that women shouldn't be out except in burqas or whatever head to toe covering
or
for
with
their
a
particular.
man. Yeah,
Right.
like, yeah. No, I mean, I
And
ran into that in Paris myself, and I wasn't staying in the suburbs. I was staying pretty close into town. There was a local bar that was very, it was very, because it was a kind of a working class neighborhood I was staying in. And yeah, the local bars, it was men only. It's a good thing I wasn't trying to meet any girls because there were none to be found.
precisely,
In the local bars, like, yeah.
they don't believe women should go out in public at all unless they're escorted by a family member. And, no socializing unless they choose what your social event is going to be. You know, as a side issue, people here in America talk about slavery and the ramifications of slavery, but they fail to look at the Muslim culture and see that women basically are treated like slaves. And they don't want to address it because, as you and I have spoken to in the past, they're afraid. The Muslim community, the males in that community have no problem causing destruction, as we've seen in Paris and various other Western European countries. And I believe Americans here are afraid to confront the issue for having, for the same thing occurring. And so, in not combating it face to face, they are allowing that culture to take over, the American culture. You can look to, any of the, for like Pakistan and stuff, pre 1970, Pakistan, the women dressed just like Western women. After 1970, they were in the head to toe covering and couldn't do anything. And
No, that was true in Afghanistan as well. Many parts of the Middle East were modern and progressive and all that sort of thing. And then when Wahhabism out of Saudi Arabia came in, all that progress was lost.
yep. And even now, in Saudi Arabia, you as a female try to drive and they're apt to stone you or throw you in jail, depending on if you're poor or if you're rich, or if you're a member of the royal family. But you still, as a female, will be punished for that. And that's the kind of problems that are coming to the United States when they've exported their schools and their religion here to the United States. And like CARE allows this and encourages this to be implemented into the public school system. And most Americans that are non-Muslim do not fight back because they're afraid. And being fearful just means you're giving up your culture to be overwhelmed by this other culture. And my question is, in say 30 years, what's this country going to be like? We'll never be able to have another Playboy magazine. We'll never be able to have another bikini model on front of Sports Illustrated. But yet no one thinks that will happen, but it's already happening over in Europe.
No, for certain, for certain. Well, speaking of the 80s, we're up to 84. Grenada and Beirut. Ronald Reagan, for all of his posturing, had a lot of kind of low-level conflicts that resulted in deaths. You had Black Hawk Down in Somalia, you had the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, you had the whole Grenada adventure and disaster, but that never seemed to affect him electorally. Why do you think that is?
I think he was like Bill Clinton. He had Teflon coating.
Yeah.
Really, truly.
I mean,
he could lay it off onto other members of his administration because he, for the most part, was never really associated with these events. It was always members of his administration that led the events or made the decisions. I mean, he had so much plausible deniability. It was incredible. That he just wasn't seen to be part of it. It's other members of his administration. And I don't know if that was necessarily because he had a strong, loyal group of people that protected him like that, or if his administration really was that bad. It's hard to say, but yeah,
I
he
mean,
had.
by the number of criminal indictments is a bit damning, though. There were over 200 criminal indictments of various and sundry Reagan people. That's not great.
No,
History's kind of forgotten that, but that's not great.
well, yeah, it's again, you are coming to the end of the big investigative reporter time frame, and everybody wanted to be Woods and Woodward and
Oh, what
the
is
other
his
reporter.
name? Yeah,
Pardon me?
yeah. I don't
Yeah,
remember his name either, but yeah, Bob Woodward and whatever his name was.
right.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to be those two. Everybody wanted to have their big deep throat contact to make
Watergate
them.
scandal, yeah.
Yes. And so there were people still actively, digging through stuff like that. And so, and, just like what happened, with people's reactions to Donald Trump, same kind of reactions with Ronald Reagan. Democrats, were just, not happy. They were angry. So there was always something or someone rather looking to find a crack in the facade so that they could say, oh yeah, you're an evildoer. And, we want, looking to try to impeach. And, that, yeah, like I said, Ronald Reagan, he was pretty much Teflon. People liked him. I'm not sure if they liked him because he was an actor who, again, spoke strong, acted decisive, and, so on, and was willing. I think this might be the issue. He was willing to step up and try things, or his administration was. So, and they failed. Don't get me wrong. There was several that failed, but there was also several that succeeded. But we always remember the failures. We don't always remember the successes.
I think my thing with the Reagan years that I think is so impactful is so much of the modern media environment, financial environment, and corporate, oh my goodness, heaven forfend we regulate anyone. I think like that all really was pioneered by Reagan. He broke the back of the unions by firing the air traffic controllers. They deregulated a lot. They actually did not lower taxes. Reagan raised taxes 13 times. Ted Cruz would be good to be mindful of that. All this sort of thing. But like so much of like the problems my generation have had and so many of the economic difficulties that we have endured really started under Reagan. And I wonder like because you were in your like 20s and the 80s, if you understood that at the time, like what the long term reaches of that would be, or if it was just kind of temporary day trading to get the economy out of the slump of the 70s.
For me, it was more along the lines of, hooray, we actually are able to get jobs. Hooray, we actually can afford to do things, when we had been through the 70s when you couldn't do a whole lot of anything. And I don't know that people particularly thought about it, but you also got to remember in that time frame back then, people, though Lyndon Baines Johnson and Kennedy were making the effort to set up the great social net or safety net for everybody, people still wanted to deal with their own money. And they did not necessarily believe the government was wise steward of that. And that has become a cultural issue because of the baby boomers. And and I'm on the back side of that. And so my views don't match the boomers on the front edge and how they thought that everything should be socially changed. But even then, they didn't want to socially change it until it started affecting them. And that's when you started getting a lot of changes with them teaching their kids, because then all of a sudden they're the over 30 crowd instead of the under never trust anybody over 30 crowd. All of a sudden they were the 30 crowd. And then all of a sudden these things started mattering to them. They wanted to keep their money, and, they didn't want to pay all the taxes. And, so that came into being, and I don't believe that they recognize that. And if today's any indication, they still don't recognize that. And I'm anti-government. I'm the first to admit it. I think the government is way too intrusive in so many areas. And I know that you and a great many of you out there are of the opinion that the government, should just take the money, and spread it out across to everybody and make everybody equal that way. And I still fail to see how taking everybody's money by way of 99% in taxes is going to achieve the equality in wealth goal that you all are striving for. I don't know that the reality really is there, other than I identify with the fact that being poor, as you pointed out about your age group, is unpleasant because the 70s were like that too. There's just never been a good answer. And, trying to increase the tax rate to such a level has been a problem for a lot of people personally. And I don't know, I'm not sure how you convince people that they want to be willing to give up all their money.
When it comes to economics, I think one of the biggest problems that Reagan did that has affected my generation is he undid all the regulations and taxes of the New Deal that caused the great prosperity that much of your generation benefited from that was not given to your kids.
See, I don't think
And I feel like
the
it was like good at the time for you guys, but had an adverse benefit on us.
See, I don't view that way, because I don't see that the New Deal did that. I see that as World War II came to an end. Everybody had sacrificed mightily for that. And then when peace came, there was all these people, these men and women that came home, and that was when people started inventing things. You had all kinds of scientists and stuff come out of that war that were ready to build things, create things, and go forward with this. So I don't see the New Deal as the trigger for that. I see more of when everybody started coming home, you had a housing boom, you had a baby boom, you had a job boom. You had all of this, and you are correct in that they've not passed on their money. Matter of fact, as you well know, in our family, we did not get the benefit of that either for one of the boomers.
But conversely, though, at the same time, we also, during that period, had huge government investments in science, R&D, and research, which eventually would get us to go to the moon and all sorts of other things. Like you had reasonably high taxes so that you had well-funded government services. We regulated prices on everything from airline tickets to taxi fares to commodity prices, which are even still regulated to today. Like the economy was constructed in such a way that wages and productivity were oftentimes tied together. And we also had the advantage of being pretty much the only country not destroyed by World War II. So everyone was ready to buy our stuff. So we had a wonderful export economy. And I feel like with Reagan and his let's set the country free and get rid of these regulations, he allowed the banks to start merging again. All the things that FDR and company tried to solve about the Great Depression, Reagan undid, and then we had 2008.
Yeah, I can see your point on that. I agree with you about the regulations. Not in all areas has the lack of regulation been a benefit, and we're seeing that today with the consolidation of the movie industry, internet companies, just some companies just being completely dominant. And I can see that, and I agree, that is a problem. I don't know that imposing all the regulations back solves the problem, in that what it ended up being was, with those high taxes, was once again even worse than what we're doing now. We were subsidizing everything. And I don't know that subsidizing everything is the answer either. I think a lot of people and businesses prefer to be successful on their own, though maybe now after the pandemic, maybe that, is not so much with the, all the checks coming out. But the people at that time, which is not like now, were more into proving themselves, building their own businesses, being independent. It was a whole different breed of people. And I believe that that's what today's people fail to understand, is that the people of today are much different than the type of people back in the 60s and 70s. Because back in the 60s and 70s, we were raised to do it ourselves. We were raised to rely on our families and our friends, and mostly ourselves, to be able to raise a family, be able to support the family, and so on and so forth. And that was important to the people back in that time frame. And so therefore, for them, and me included, it was important that we be able to keep as much of our income as we could to be able to achieve that goal. But that was how all of us were raised. I was raised on a farm. On a farm, you had to be self-sufficient. You had to be able to butcher your own critters. You had to be able to go out and round them up. You had to grow your own food. You didn't get to go to town and buy your food out of the grocery store all the time. That just didn't happen. So there was an independent streak there that was not happy that the government was taking their money, and Ronald Reagan tapped into that. He had seen he understood how people resented their money being taken to support, and I know I'm going to catch grief for this, for the welfare state, the welfare people, because at that time, being on welfare was considered a bad thing. No one wanted to be on welfare. No one wanted to be showing up in the social services office to take money and get food stamps. That's just how it was. Whereas now that's different. And I believe Ronald Reagan tapped into that anger about how the government was taking a person's money to support these other groups of people. And that was pretty powerful in that time frame with those people.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, which brings us to 1988. We have George H.W. Bush, who'd been vice president for 8 long years with Reagan, and Michael Dukakis?
Yes.
I should have looked this up ahead of time, rather than relying on memory. Yes, so 1988 was a very important election. One, I was born. So you were heading to the polls with a 6-month-old.
Yep. And I did not vote
in November.
And I did not vote for him. No.
But you didn't vote for Michael Dukakis, I bet.
I did not vote for him either. That was the first time I voted for a third party.
Yeah, which is just, and it's kind of funny because I remember the first time we had this discussion, I was like, oh, I know how you voted for every presidential election since you could vote. And I literally got almost all of them wrong, including this one. So what was, okay, so I get not voting for Dukakis. He was Michael Dukakis. Why didn't you go for H.W. Bush?
He was, to be candid, he was slimy.
I mean, he was the director of the CIA at one time. I think you have to be slimy to do that job.
That's probably true, but unfortunately, he was not able to get away from that. And even though, his wife worked really hard to make him, look all warm and fuzzy, and she came across as a very warm woman, there was, I did not care for his behavior. I did not care for what he had done in Maine. I didn't care what he had done for in Texas. He's what one would call today. He was a Beltway politician. There was not a means for him to connect in particular, and I'm not quite sure why so many people connected with him, other than the fact that Ronald Reagan endorsed him because he was Ronald Reagan's vice president, and that wasn't
Right.
good enough for me.
Okay. Now, I think a lot of people don't know that actually Bill Barr, who was Attorney General with Trump, was also George H.W. Bush's Attorney General and squashed the Iran-Contra investigation,
Yep, he
which
surely
I
was.
thought was very interesting.
Bill Barr,
Um,
Bill Barr has been in a lot of things. He's a Beltway bureaucrat. And
yeah, hardcore.
there's abundance of those.
Yeah, hardcore. So now that kind of fast forwards us to 1992. Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush. Bill Clinton is the first baby boomer candidate for president. He was your generation's first candidate for president. And I don't believe he voted for Clinton in 92. I just
Nope,
don't
didn't vote
understand a
for
world
either
where
one
that
of
would
them.
occur.
Yep. Nope. I know what Bill Clinton was in Arkansas. No. He was a womanizer in Arkansas as a governor, and I understand he tried to do much better when he decided to run for president. He was very charismatic, except that he had a lousy reputation in Arkansas, and I was not willing to endorse that.
Yeah. And then still no Bush for you. Just both
No,
times. You're just
still
like, no,
no.
thank you.
Nope,
Just, no,
nope.
thank you. How did you feel about George H.W. Bush handling the Rodney King riots in 92? A lot of people felt like he didn't really do enough, didn't bother, didn't care.
Well, probably he didn't. We had the Harlem riots back in the 60s, and you let the city burn down, it refreshes, you rebuild it, and you start over again. And that's basically what happened in LA during those riots, and then basically what happened under Bush's administration was it wasn't Harlem. I can't remember what it was in LA, but they had the riots back in the 60s there, and burnt everything down, and it was a repeat. And I think Bush didn't care because he had already been through the first set of riots in California, and so it was just like, oh, ho hum, this is what they do. We'll send in money afterwards, we'll rebuild it, and the cycle repeats.
Yeah. So another kind of one-term president. What do you think really tilted the 92 election for Clinton? I mean,
Bush
I think history remembers it as "read my lips, no new taxes,"
Yep.
and then he raised taxes. But like, do you think it was just the taxes thing, or was it something else?
I think it was the taxes thing. I think it was also that he did not continue the Reagan legacy, which a lot of people expected, and I believe that a great many of the voters were angry about that he didn't follow through on what he had said he would. When he said he would take over, he would just continue Ronald Reagan's policies, and then he didn't, and people noticed that. I also think that again, at that time we were starting to see more in the line of social unrest. Rodney King lasted longer than anybody expected, and then you had this idea of just too much violence in general. Well, let me rephrase that. You could put it on TV as a video. You could now start beginning to put it on the internet as a video. You were able to reach out to more people than before, when you had just the three news networks. And 92 was kind of a start of that, because the internet was coming out, becoming public, and people were throwing everything up there, to see,
Well, and the 24-hour cable news cycle by that time was in
Yep.
full swing. And
Yep.
the Gulf War in 91 had CNN kind of really made a name for itself with that. So, that completely changed the media landscape.
Yep. And so, everything people were just getting bombarded all the time over this. And I think that added to his problems as well, because I don't believe he had a team that was able to utilize the media as well as Clinton did. Bill Clinton had a team that knew how to utilize that, and they did it to the best that anybody until Obama has ever done it. And that, I think, did not help him. He was exposed to a lot of things that him and his team was not prepared for, and it showed. And it's Clinton came along and showed how you could be charismatic. You could be a good old Southern boy and still be charismatic to people that weren't from the South. And that really reached a lot of people, except for those who knew him in his home state. They knew what he was, but everybody else was pretty naive and bought his deal. So that was, I think, part of his issue as well, because now all of his problems were being shown up by the Clinton team, and he didn't have a way to reply back and counteract on those items that were brought forth.
Yeah, the other kind of aspect of this that I think was very interesting, and I think Bill Clinton became a victim of this, certainly by the late 90s with the Lewinsky thing, is, and I think this has definitely been true since the Reagan years, and I think it's an outgrowth of the 60s, a lot of moralistic hand-wringing. The kids do not dress properly and they say weird words and they're doing drugs and the drink and all this. And there's kind of all this moralistic hand-wringing going on about, the morals of society just aren't what they used to be. And I feel like both Reagan and Bush really capitalized on that.
That's been going on, though. That was back in the 20s. I mean, go back and look at the Roaring 20s and see how parents carried on about that. Every generation has had its rebellious moments, and their parents have wrung their hands about it forever. And that's not even changed up to today. Now, capitalizing on it, absolutely. Any charismatic candidate has been able to capitalize on it and gather the hand wringers on one side and the rebellious types on the other. And I think the boomers was a shining example of that, because they were the biggest generation to be rebellious. You can't trust anyone over 30. That really made an impact down the line. And any candidate, as you put, like Clinton coming forward, if you were political and you were on the campus in the 70s and stuff, you were part of that and you knew how young people felt. And he made the most of that. He absolutely reached out and made the most of that. And Obama came along and repeated it, that he was able to reach that rebellious group of people and say, I hear you. I understand you. I'm willing to be there with you. And Clinton and Obama were great at that. They had a media team that really knew how to manipulate that, and very successful.
No, definitely. So we fast forward to 1996. Bill Clinton, Bob Dole. Bob Dole is still alive. Did you know that?
I did.
He was on CBS Sunday Morning last. I honestly thought he was dead. To be quite honest with you, I thought he died. I was surprised. Still alive, still here.
Yep, I read about his birthday. He had a birthday, and that's how come I knew he was still alive.
Yeah. So, Bill Clinton, Bob Dole. This is the first presidential election I actually remember, because I was 8.
Yep.
And it's my understanding you also did more of your third-party voting.
I did.
So
not gonna vote for those two main parties.
I mean, we know your issues with Bill Clinton. and a year later the whole country would be introduced to it. What was wrong with Bob Dole?
Jimmy Carter, Joe Biden. He was just another one of them. There was nothing charismatic about him. His policies were not particularly forceful. He was, he didn't come across as making sure or intimating that he could make his policies workable. He was a senator. I mean, senators are not particularly known for being strong candidates. They're more, along the lines of glad handing and backroom dealing, and that's, even though those are probably good traits for a president, they're not good traits to have on the campaign trail. And for him, he just never came across as a strong candidate that could be taken serious to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, considering, I feel like 96 was a race for Republicans to lose, because the Clintons were already, by that time Whitewater had started. Clintons were already on the back foot in 96. And that was something where it's almost kind of interesting that he got the nomination and then subsequently managed to lose when the wind was really at his back.
He was a compromise candidate. Not enough people liked him. And not enough people knew about him. He was a senator from, or the former senator from Kansas. Kansans knew about him, but the rest of the country was pretty clueless on what his positions were on things, on agendas and economy and stuff. And he was a compromise candidate. The Republican Party couldn't come to an agreement on a strong candidate, and he joined the ranks of Jimmy Carter, except that Clinton was still strong enough. Why would you vote for a Republican who was that weak when you have Clinton? For a lot of people, that's what it came down to, is what you're dealing with Clinton. He's just got problems all over the place, and you've got this unknown, and a lot of people didn't want to deal with an unknown, especially a possible weak unknown.
I mean,
remember his wife. Everybody grudged him his wife. She was a very strong character, and people didn't like that at that time.
Would become a senator herself a couple years later.
But
Elizabeth
she
Dole.
was, from their perspective, a lot of people thought that she was going to be what they thought Nancy Reagan was, running the presidency, and like Hillary, running the presidency from the shadow of the first lady. And a lot of people did not want to have that with Mrs. Dole. They already had it with Hillary Clinton. They'd already had it with Nancy Reagan. They did not want another woman doing that.
No, that definitely makes sense. So late 90s, we have the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the Clinton impeachment. I don't imagine your opinions are that crazy about either of those topics. So that probably gets it. I mean,
Monica was stupid. She was, and it's unfortunate to call her that, but she was naive and stupid. She's in the White House. It's awesome. She is where there's power. And here's Bill Clinton, who is a known flirt, a known womanizer. And she's an intern. She's basically a nobody. And here is this powerful man who's interested in her, who I can't imagine, any young person like that wouldn't be caught up in that. And
of her own admission,
I felt bad for her.
Well, and of her own admission, like she has admitted in like her book that was a huge factor. And yeah, so it's,
her life was destroyed, and the Clintons went out of their way to destroy it. And that's the thing I didn't like about Bill Clinton at that time, was he could have manned up and admitted that he did it and that he was wrong. He could have taken responsibility and probably would have never even got to an impeachment if he had just owned up to it. Instead,
well, I think more people were mad about the fact he lied about the affair than the affair itself. I think if he'd come out and said, yes, I've been stooping my clerk, people
Yes.
probably would have been more forgiving about it all. It was the lie that pissed people off, not the fact that, I mean, presidents have been philanderers. Hello, John Kennedy.
Yep.
We're kind of used to that. I think it was the fact that he kind of lied about it. And it piled on. Like, the Whitewater deal didn't make any sense. That seemed skeezy. All of a sudden, there's this Monica Lewinsky thing. That's like, it was just too much skis. And Republicans, being ever the political opportunists, being the politicians that they are, took advantage of the moment. Never waste a good crisis.
Neither party wastes a crisis. That's just being a politician.
That's being politics. That's politics. So we're up to 2000. George W. Bush and Al Gore.
Oh no. I will allow that I voted for George W. Bush.
And Pete, the listener should know we had a Gore Lyman with the BER and Lieberman crossed out sign in our front yard. I was 12. I remember I helped make the sign.
Yep. I regret that vote. Because what happened with 9/11 and what George Bush brought into being after that with the
Patriot Act. The Patriot Act, yeah.
The Patriot Act. That is probably the one vote I seriously regret, because everybody thought that he was a centrist, and turned out that he definitely was more of a surveillance state kind of guy.
Yeah.
And I can't say that he didn't step up and do well with 9/11. I mean, he did do the good leadership thing. He was there. He was compassionate. He was understanding. He did the whole thing. Everything was great with all of that. And then there was the Patriot Act. And at that point, it was, okay, that compassion part was a facade, because this is who you really are when you want this surveillance state. And I got to say that, once the bureaucrats got their teeth into that, as well as the politicians after him, it continues to be exploited. The Patriot Act continues to be exploited and utilized against Americans. And that's one of the reasons why I regret my George W. Bush vote. He also made a mess out of the economy. He wasn't the compassionate conservative that he claimed he was. And, I think a lot of his policies has been a problem coming forward as well.
Yeah, I think the difficult thing economically of the Bush 2 years was we had the dot-com bubble, and then the recession after 9/11, and those two, 9/11 kind of got the press out of that, but that recession was already coming because of the dot-com bubble. Economy was already on shaky foundations, and then 9/11 just sealed the deal. And then we did the whole housing thing, and housing lending expanded, and then, well, we saw what happened with all of that. So, yeah, it seems like on either end, in fact, he said in an interview about the financial crisis one time, my presidency started with a crisis and ended with a crisis. It was just kind of all 8 years of it was just sort of a crisis. The invasion of Afghanistan over 9/11 made sense. The 2003 Iraq War invasion, I don't remember what your opinion of that was at the time.
Well, I was somewhat ambivalent about the invasion. I was not a big fan of it. I think that they just wanted a regime change that was a little more friendly to the United States. And instead, what has happened is that we just have bigger problems in the Middle East now. And those problems now are crossing the ocean to the United States. So I don't think that what they may have thought they were going to achieve, I think backfired spectacularly, as we are seeing today.
Yes, and it's kind of funny because, so that brings us to 2004. I gather you did not vote for Bush again.
No, I did not. And I did not vote for
third
Obama
party
either.
voting. No, that was John Kerry. That was John Kerry.
I still didn't vote for him. still went back to the third party.
Yeah, it's more of your third party voting in 2004. We kind of had an interesting, like, right. So George Bush wins election in 2004 quite handily against John Kerry and the whole Swift boat veteran thing, and John Kerry's record in Vietnam and George Bush's record in Vietnam and all this sort of thing. And a lot of kind of old boomer issues around Vietnam kind of churned up in the 04 election.
Yeah, they did.
And then in 2005, we kind of find out that the whole Iraq invasion was entirely unnecessary. There were no weapons of mass destruction. It was all sort of a lie. I was 17 in 2005. For my generation, this would be kind of the first of a couple seminal moments that I think would really define us politically. So I think the lying over the Iraq war would have a great effect on my generation, especially the older contingent that was in college or their 20s when that happened. I'm in the middle of my generation. And then, of course, the financial crisis. But what did you think about the fact that it all kind of came out that the whole thing was a lie? There were no WMDs to be found.
Well, in my case, I am generally skeptical of politicians anyway, and secret agencies on top of all that. But I was not thrilled with how the retaliation was over the oil fields either. There was problems with that as well, and I don't think either side could have handled that particularly well. The WMD issue, I agree. I think it probably was an excuse to invade. Even now, I'm still not quite sure what the best excuse was for invading, other than, just wanting a regime change. Or, to some degree, I could see, trying to recover oil fields. OPEC was still flexing its muscles at that point and driving up fuel prices. So I could see that there's a lot of reasons to do it. But after 9/11, it wasn't such a far-fetched idea to accept WMDs, because you just had, 3 airplanes used as weapons of mass destruction to destroy parts of the United States. So it was not hard to get people to be willing to entertain the idea that there was more there that could come to the United States and do more mass destruction.
No, and I think that was, I think that's why it took so many years to figure out that we were sold a bill of goods that was not necessarily what was on the tin. Just the fear of the time.
Yes, and again, politicians know how to manipulate that, and politicians who are able to utilize the media to achieve those goals can absolutely easily manipulate emotions, because they have the access to the people: television, internet, radio. You have, as a president, you have the ability to do all of that, because you can go on TV, you can put your face out there, and people will give you the benefit of a doubt and listen to you. And we have seen that with every president. People will grant a president the benefit of a doubt until he makes too big of an error.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely the case. So that gets us up to 2008. This is my first presidential election. I know for a fact you did not vote for Barack Obama.
No, I didn't. Third party again.
Yeah, so this is Barack Obama and John McCain, and you're back on your third party voting. Why not? Why was John McCain not for you?
He came across as being pompous, and I did not believe that what he says he endured in Vietnam was entirely accurate. I found a lot of his credibility to be fake, and he liked being a contrarian. And I didn't really feel as if he would be willing to work for the best of the country or the people, that he, would just do whatever he wanted. I thought he would be a complete renegade president, unaccountable to anybody.
Well, I think that's what they were selling him as. Sarah Palin called him a maverick and all this sort of thing, and I think that was what they were selling him as.
But that's what he was. His Senate record showed him to be a contrarian. His military record showed him to be a contrarian. His representing Arizona, as a politician from the get-go, he was just a contrarian, and he liked being a contrarian. And I don't have a problem with that, but I hardly believe that that can be a unifying force for the country if your whole outlook is, as we've found with local politics here, I know best, and therefore what I know is best for everybody. And we've ran into that with politicians already, that they believe, or their administration believes, that they know best, and the rest of us just need to go along with it. But he was really in your face about it, and his daughter reflects that today where she's at, that she's in your face about that. And that, I think, was off-putting. He chose not to smooth his edges. He didn't try, at least in my view, he did not try to reach out and appeal to a wider group of people. He just wanted people to take him as he was. And as a senator, you can do that. But as a presidential candidate, I don't think you can so much. You have to be better than that.
Do you think the financial crisis and his seeming lack of any plan for dealing with it had an effect on the eventual outcome?
I think so, because people were in trouble.
Yeah.
And he didn't have a plan. I mean, he wasn't able to articulate a plan. And I don't know, to me, I think if I'm that much of a contrarian and I want to be a contrarian, my people around me better have a plan for me to be able to use my cantankerous ways to show why my plan is better. Even if I'm going to be cantankerous, you better give me a plan. And he didn't seem to be able to get his people to even come up with an idea, which surprised me, because as a senator and working with the budget and stuff, he should have known better. But I'm not sure if he just thought that would be something that he didn't enjoy dealing with, or thought he would just take care of it better or later, rather. I don't know. But he didn't bring forth the Senate skill set that he supposedly had as well as he could have.
Well, it's very interesting. There's a documentary where they kind of gathered all the players from the financial crisis. And the person who also said exactly what you just said was actually Barack Obama. He said I feel like John was not served well by his staff. Because remember, they had that big meeting in Washington with Obama and McCain and Pelosi and everybody important to figure out what to do about the financial crisis. And it was he showed up and didn't have nothing. Like, the Democrats came along and said, well, we really probably should save the banks and figure out how to get this through Congress. And McCain shows up with the Republicans, and they, Bush is sitting there, just kind of like, we're trying to figure out what to do, because Bush is still in office for 4 more months. We're trying to figure out what to do. And McCain doesn't have any plans. The meeting devolves into a disaster. And I think that just kind of became the narrative. McCain didn't have any ideas of what to do about the financial crisis. And it was the scandal that soon began to define the 2008 campaign. And that, combined with Sarah Palin, I think made a lot of people uncomfortable with him.
I don't know that Sarah Palin was necessarily a bad choice. I think that his team utilized her poorly, because she was extremely popular in Alaska for the most part. And I think that if they would have allowed her to be the balance to his cantankerous ways, that could have been successful, because she did have ideas. They weren't ideas that his team necessarily wanted to hear, but she did offer ideas. And I think Mr. McCain had a tendency to shut out people who did not agree with what he thought. He had a president and a president's team he could have interacted with and got information from, and he chose not to. He chose not to accept counsel from the people around him. To some degree, he brought that lone wolf reputation on by choosing not to utilize his staff as well as he could have. And I think, frankly, he chose the staff that way. He wanted a weaker staff because he was a strong personality and he did not like to be confronted. And I think that's where they ran into a problem with Sarah Palin, even though she got slammed for a lot of stuff. As a vice presidential candidate, she didn't have a whole lot of control over anything. And she, in some regards, got clobbered because of how he also reacted to her. So, he hurt himself not only with his vice president candidate, but he hurt himself because he chose to have weaker staff around him instead of somebody who could say, John, you need to stop and we need to, get a plan in action. And he chose not to do that. And it showed.
No, definitely. That brings us up to 2012. Now, I've talked about this at length. I only voted for Obama once. By 2012, I was tepid about Obama in 2008, and by 2012, I had it. Was not impressed, was ready for a change. I voted for Mitt Romney. How about you?
Third party.
You and your third party voting.
I could not stand Mitt Romney.
I've always said this,
him.
and people think I am nuts. I think Mitt Romney would make a great president.
Oh, ick. He didn't do that great for Massachusetts. The man is like a nomad. What state can I go to that will elect me to do something?
I mean, big facts. Like governor of Massachusetts, senator from Utah. Mitt Romney gets around. That's
just like Hillary. I'm from Arkansas, but then I'm from New York. Come on, no. He, today he looks pretty, I guess pretty central, but at the time he was not, and to me, still not. He really wasn't a Republican with at that time, Republican values. He was definitely willing, because he came out of Massachusetts, he was willing to tax the dickens out of everybody. I mean, he had the big ditch problem. I mean, look how bad that was.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was.
He hasn't necessarily done that well for Utah. I mean, it's pretty sorrowful when your own state party is booing you off the stage and are quite happy with telling you that they're fine with doing it.
But I mean, conversely, though, I think much of that with Mitt Romney now is because Mitt Romney was the only Republican to vote for the first Trump impeachment, to vote to convict, and has loudly contradicted the whole Trump agenda. And the Trump agenda has really taken over the Republican Party, and Mitt Romney's not on board with that. And so he's in a very odd position in his party these days.
Well, yeah, the Republican Party is split. There's no denying that. That there are those that one would call their Democrat lights versus the populist party of Trump. It'll be interesting to see who comes out of it and actually gets control of the Republican Party. Despite everybody preaching that it's Trump, I really don't think it is. But at the time with Romney's problem was Romney didn't know when to shut up. And he didn't think about the things he said. He made himself look old when he came out with the binders of women.
Full binders of women, yeah.
And he made himself look old at that point, and that did not help him. He has since learned to be a little more careful about how he speaks. He's more circumspect about it than he was then. But again, he was, he could say stuff like that in Massachusetts and get away with it, but in the rest of the country, not so much. And so that hurt him. I mean, that really hurt him with the woman vote. The media just went all over him, about how he just didn't care about women, even though, he had, a wife and kids and grandkids, females.
Yeah.
And, they stepped up and said he's not like that, but it didn't matter because, the media and the Democrat Party ran with the binders of women and they made it sound nasty, and that did him in.
And the Romney campaign, I think the Republican Party as a whole in 2012 did not understand the power of social media.
Nope.
The Obama campaign invented how to run for president on Facebook.
Oh yeah.
And the Romney even by 2012, the Republicans hadn't figured it out, and the Romney campaign never figured it out. And
Nope.
so that was kind of multiple odds sort of factors. I think everybody was surprised, least of all, I think Barack Obama himself in 2012, considering how not great. I mean, history has forgotten it now. Things were not great for the Obama presidency going into 2012. There were quite a few problems. The recovery from the financial recession was not going anywhere fast. The economy was still very weak. Unemployment was still not great. Nothing had really happened with the wars. I mean, it was, it was tough. It was going in 12 was really tough for the Obama people. And I think they were themselves surprised that they won again.
Actually, it was their race to throw away, I think. Romney was, nothing at that point. It would have taken Obama doing something extraordinarily awful for him to lose that race, because Romney had made himself look so bad. So, there was just no way Obama couldn't win that. So, so that was the deal on that one.
I attended the Colorado Republican Party election night watch party at Mile High Stadium in 2012 because I was still working in Republican politics at the time, and the mood in the room was quite surprising. I think a lot of people thought Romney was going to pull it out.
Yeah, I know the hope was big there.
Yeah.
So
definitely. Well, that leads us to everybody's favorite election of all, 2016.
Yeah,
Trump
yeah.
v. Clinton. You said you didn't vote for Trump.
Not true. Not true.
Oh, you voted for Trump in 2016.
I did vote for Trump. It was a negotiated vote.
How did you negotiate this vote? Walk me through that.
It was a negotiation between me and John. I wanted one thing on our ballot. He wanted another. And so it was negotiated that if for me to get what I wanted, I had to give him what he wanted. So that, is what I ended up doing. And so I ended up voting for Mr. Trump. And
okay.
There's been pluses and minuses. He's very charismatic. He does have his problems. He like any other politician, he didn't keep all of his campaign promises either. I still do not understand why people are so vociferous in their hate. I don't think I have ever, in the years I've been around, seen someone as hated as this particular person is, and not just him, but all the people that have voted for him. I find that disturbing, to be honest, in that one can't, after a president has lost or moved on, why it is still necessary in this day and age to not only hate him but hate his supporters. I do not get that. I think that is obsessiveness, insanity, too much emotion, a lack of ability to be reasonable, too emotional. this was all about emotion. There was nothing reasonable about the campaign. It was just about emotion. And because of the emotion, you know, the Democrats ended up with Joe Biden, and that's what we've ended up with as a president, because there was really no other candidate that the Democrats could offer up that would be accepted by a good portion of the Democrat Party.
Well, but that's I mean, to circle back to 2016 for a second. Well, we'll get to 2020 in a jiffy, but 2016 for a second. So I was a hold my nose and vote for Hillary Clinton Democrat. I have my issues with Hillary Clinton. I think towards the end, I started to actually kind of like her. But I think the biggest problem with Hillary Clinton is she's highly educated. She's an academic. People just don't like her. There's something about, and I get that because I'm this kind of the same way. There's something about her people do not like.
I think that at 2016 with her, because they had the same problem with Ivanka Trump or any of the Trump women. Matter of fact, any of the women, even Michelle Obama, there's been problems with strong, powerful women. I don't care what color you are. For the most part, there, even among women, there's a struggle with accepting a strong woman. And we see that with Kamala Harris today, that, you know, how she's made her way to where she is has been called into question. Whether she's, you know, one considers her powerful or strong or whatnot, she couldn't get to be president on her own because of how she was, and I think her being female. I don't think her policies did her any favors either. But with Hillary, I think that's the same problem. You know, strong females are just not easily tolerated right now in a political office. And unfortunately, I think when you look at the Pelosi's and you look at the Feinsteins and you look at just women in general within Congress, that you see any strong woman is getting hammered.
That's more true of the left than the right. I mean,
well, I mean, you got
people don't
you got
go
Marjorie
after
Greene out there.
But people don't go after Lisa Murkowski of Alaska or the gal from Maine, Susan Collins. Don't go. I feel like women on the right get much more of a pass than women on the left. And part of that's how the left treats women. But the women from the right get much more leeway than women from the left.
Well, I guess it depends on where you're coming from. If you're on the left, you're not a big fan of Murkowski and Collins because they're women and they're not supporting women's issues.
True.
If you're a woman on the left, you have certain issues that you're supposed to endorse. But at the same time, the problem with the women on the left, unfortunately, Nancy Pelosi is a classic example, and so is Kamala Harris. And unfortunately, Hillary was too. They're screechy. And no one cares for screechy women.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, and women need to learn that. They need to, I know everybody says you just got to accept them as they are. Well, no one accepted John McCain for him being cantankerous, and most voters are not going to be too accepting of women who are screeching all the time. And if they don't figure out how to modulate that, that's always going to be a problem for them. And that is one of the things that Susan Collins and Murkowski has learned. And unfortunately, the Marjorie Greenes of the Republican Party hasn't learned it yet, because they are going up against the AOC part of the Democrat Party. So you've got screechers coming in on both sides, on both parties, and it's becoming an ugly sight, because now you've got the cat fight. You basically have got women fighting women, and everybody else is sitting on the sidelines going, well, isn't this entertaining?
Do you think that George Bush and Donald Trump benefited from having quiet first ladies? They only hauled Melania out on a few select occasions, and Laura Bush, did her reading program because she was a teacher and all this type of thing. And like, but Laura Bush was not in our lives every day. Melania was not in our lives every day in the same way that Hillary Clinton was in the '90s or Michelle Obama was in the 2000s.
I think that it aided them because I think with Hillary and Michelle, it became a vision of husband and wife competing against each other to be who can be the bigger power between the two
Yeah.
of them. And I think people noticed that, and people prefer one member being supportive and the other member being the leader. And that, I think, comes back to Nancy Reagan, because Nancy Reagan was accused of being the leader in the second term of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and people struggled with that. And then you had Hillary and Michelle out there doing it completely in the open. And again, I think because of how they were pushing all the time of who they were, that women who would have been tolerant of them was put off by them, because they chose not to embrace all women. They chose to only embrace working women. And at that time, there was still a lot of at-home women, and there still is. And it doesn't do a woman very good to be putting down the stay-at-home crowd. And
Yeah.
Hillary and Obama and Michelle Obama was pretty blatant about how they didn't like that. You had Hillary with her cookie comments,
Yes.
with Tammy Wynette during, Bill's impeachment trial. You had Michelle out there speaking about how, she couldn't respect women who stayed at home and did nothing but support their man. There was a certain level of contempt there that did not make them attractive.
Well, I think that's still true today. I don't think
Yes.
that's gone anywhere.
No,
I
I
mean,
don't think it's changed.
I mean, I think on the left there are a lot of women who really have some resentful issues towards women who choose to stay home and raise children.
And I agree. And I've been down that road, and I understand it completely. If you're a stay-at-home mom, you are considered a sit at home and eat bonbons kind of mom, that you don't do anything else other than just sit at home and, again, watch soap operas and eat bonbons, while other women are out there working and sweating and on and on and on. And unless
And
women,
I can say that my mom was a stay-at-home mom for like 15 years and did not watch soap operas, does not like them even now.
I didn't eat bonbons every day either.
No.
But women are, unless a woman can come along, and Kamala Harris is not it. If a woman can't come along and unite those two parts of any of the voting blocks, there's never in the near future going to be a successful lady president, if they're going to alienate the part of the people that stay home and choose to raise their kids and choose to be supportive of their husbands' careers and stuff.
And here's what's funny is in Democrat leadership, there are many former stay-at-home moms. Nancy Pelosi is Catholic, has 5 kids. She was a stay-at-home mom before she got into politics. She didn't get into politics till her 40s when her kids were grown.
And yet she does not.
Most people don't know that about her, but it's true.
But she doesn't bring it. She doesn't bring it forth either. She makes it like it was a bad thing.
Yeah.
And
Barbara Boxer, big feminist, was a stay-at-home mom when her kids were young. It's throughout the part, it's throughout the party, but you wouldn't know it based upon the narrative.
Yep. But that's the narrative they bring forth, as if staying at home is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And to me, they should be promoting it. They should be out there saying, I stayed at home. But, part of the problem is you got to prove up that you stayed at home and you were somewhat average income versus stay at home and you were moderately wealthy.
Well, let's also face it. In this state, particularly here in 2021, one does have to be a certain amount of middle to upper middle class in order to be able to afford to stay at home. Because the price, and it's mostly the price of housing. The price of housing is so expensive.
Yep, that's true. And it requires certain amount of sacrifices, and our culture nowadays is not appreciative of sacrifices. It's more of the, just go out and get it, take a loan out, get it on your credit card. And, so that is a challenge too, until we're willing to step up and say sacrifices are worth it for the now to have a better future. We're going to continue to have this disrespect of, of the stay-at-home mom, the, saving for now, to prepare for the future, all those little things that, that people don't want to be bothered with right now.
No, that's very true. Which brings us to the 2020 election. Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. I maintain without COVID, Trump would have gotten reelected.
I agree. He would have, because the media was so, and though it's being, he's being vindicated now about the virus and where, likely where, came from and how it was created. And, they don't, like, the media does not want to give him credit for getting the vaccines going. They're okay with giving it to the Biden administration, but you can't have a vaccine, ramp up like that in 100 days. It was there before Mr. Biden was elected. But again,
and a lot of people accuse Trump of being racist when he said that the Chinese were responsible for the virus. But now the lab leak hypothesis has gained quite a bit of mainstream success, and there's evidence that certainly points to it. And the simple fact of the matter is, when it came to controlling this and letting people know so that it could be kept in China, the Chinese covered it up for at least 30 days, if not a couple months. And they were not responsible in letting people know, we have a problem. And although he was accused of racism at the time, it's kind of been vindicated on that aspect of it. And I think that's interesting.
I think that you can call it a conspiracy theory or whatever, but I truly do think that it was in the media's interest and the Biden campaign interest to, no matter what came out, to not promote it until after the election. Because you're right, if COVID had not taken over the country like it had, in the panic and everything, and the lack of good information on how to deal with it, I think the economy would have stayed strong, and I think that Mr. Trump would have been reelected. But instead, you're fighting a battle of attrition. The media hates you. You're provoking the media. You're constantly poking at them, which it becomes a vicious loop, and it feeds off of each other. And you can't deny, for the most part, the media has their bias, and their bias was not, at this point in time, above board reporting. Because I do think that they could have shown way earlier that the coronavirus did come out of China, and it did most likely come out of the lab, especially when it was still known back then that those 3 doctors went to the hospital in November. That woman said that those 3 doctors went to the November, and everybody poo-pooed it.
And now that the wet market thing has been entirely disproven, no bats were being sold at the Wuhan wet market. That really bolsters the lab leak hypothesis, and I think it's important that we get a clear understanding on that, for the future.
Well, because as we talk about regulation, to some degree, people talk about, well, we need to regulate, Facebook or Twitter, and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all talk about, well, we need to change internet regulations. I have arrived to the point where we need maybe relook at journalistic integrity, because for the most part, it seems in the last 10 years that journalists and integrity are two things that do not meet ever, as witnessed by, the reporter that wrote the lying story at the New York Times. Yeah. And, reporters that won't bring forth, accurate information because it doesn't support their agenda. And it's no small wonder people don't believe anything and that misinformation is easy to get around, because journalists and integrity are not insisted on right now. And journalists are the ones that's got to do that. And, coming at COVID after Mr. Trump is gone and trying to say, well, now we have integrity, just, at least in my view, just shows that you were a hypocrite from the get-go, that, you obscured all this. And then when your candidate got there, now we can be candid about it and make him the hero, even though the timeline says that's not true either. So they're not even attempting to even allow that, Trump got the virus online, Trump got where it came from right. They're still trying to, smooth it out to where somehow it was still Mr. Biden's success. And there's a group of people out there that just are not going to believe the media because of this inability to throw your facts out there and let them fall where they may. They wanted people to, believe that Trump lied all the time. But what do you call a journalist that hid, the information about Wuhan, or chose not to acknowledge where and who started the vaccine program? That doesn't do well.
Well, and one of the things I thought, even though it ended up being costly and trade wars don't necessarily work out that well, I was glad. One of the things I think Trump did very well was standing up to China on trade. China dumped steel, destroyed the American steel industry, dumped solar panels, destroyed American solar panel manufacturing, all this sort of thing. And neither Clinton, who did most favored nation trading status with WTO, or Bush or Obama ever did anything on trade with China. And it has been to the detriment of the American economy. And Trump was the first president to say, not so fast, and restructured trade with China. That was a good move on Trump's part.
Yes, it was. And people don't like to admit that either. And, there was a lot of Trump.
It hurts my soul a little. I don't like to give Trump credit for much of anything, but I'll give him on trade.
I understand that a lot of people don't. And I think that too many people were offended by his personality and not necessarily his policies. You can have issues with people's policies, but their personalities, come on, because there's a lot of people out there that, may not like or don't like Mr. Biden. I don't think he is that great person as a personality either. I don't know what, right now I'm not a big fan of his policies. Time will tell. But I am more willing to look at his policies versus looking at how his behavior is. Because there's a lot of people that just focus on that. And I think that's the wrong thing to focus on. You can like or dislike the man, but you should be more concerned about his good or bad policies. And that's not what the media focuses on. And that's not what people focus on either, because, that's not what Facebook or Twitter or Instagram puts out there. And
but conversely, though, many Republican voters admitted that they wish Trump had tweeted less, because Trump was constantly, daily, hourly, so inflammatory, and he trafficked in sexist language, racist language. He never seemed to want to be that inclusive. He seemed to be okay with being president of his supporters, but he never really did much to be president of the whole country, including people in his own party that weren't huge fans of him. Like, he liked that 35% of people that really liked him. That's who he seemed to be focused on, and the rest of us could just bugger off, including other Republicans.
Tell me which presidential party or president of a party has never done that. I can't think of one unifying president in the last 50 years. I think maybe Eisenhower, maybe Kennedy. Kennedy might, be the last one. But I don't think there's been a unifying president since then.
I feel like even George Bush was not I mean, even just limiting conversations to Republican presidents. I don't feel like George Bush attacked Democrats and was only the president for his party. I feel like Bush did a good job of reaching out to Democrat voters.
The reason why that is, though, is because George Bush embraced Democrat values, and that was part of his problem when he didn't win so much the second time around, is that people noticed that he wasn't upholding what they felt were Republican values, that he was out there saying, yeah, let's embrace all this Democrat value. And that's what got him laughed at about the compassionate conservative. He wasn't being a conservative as conservative, supposedly was at that time. He was being, more of a Democrat. And
that would help get the Tea Party off the ground in 2008 to 10. I mean, that would help the Tea Party get off the ground, because the whole ethos of the Tea Party was trying to get more Republicans in office who would, and I would know, I ran a Tea Party publication, I was at the scene of the crime, to get more Republicans into office who would really stick to Republican values, hardcore.
Right. Yep. And that's a problem that, the 35% you're referring to, that's the part that they don't care for. Is they're okay with compromises. They're not okay with the 90-10 split. And that's where it generally seems to work out in a lot of cases. And that's what made Trump popular, at least, in the front, was that, he was willing to take a hard line and have Democrats come meet him versus him giving in to them. And it did cause hard feelings. Him and Pelosi, Pelosi made her contempt pretty well known, which I don't respect her for, because I don't care if you don't like the president or not. You don't throw the tantrums that you do and disrespect the office of the president, which is what she did with her tearing up the speech. That was totally disrespecting of the office of president. You want to have your fit, you can have it afterwards, but you don't do it on national television. And that is what hardens a lot of people against Nancy Pelosi and Democrat Party, is because she expressed what the 35% believe she thinks of them and what she says about them, along with Hillary calling them deplorables and so on and so forth. You don't win people over by calling them names and calling them terrorists and treating them like they are forever white supremacists, because that's not an accurate view of the party, but that's makes it easier to demonize a party to get your agenda. And that is what Trump did not allow to occur. And that's what made many people feel that he was the candidate for them, because he was standing up for them and not treating them like crap.
Conversely, though, it is very difficult to not look at today's Republican Party and not see a legacy of white supremacism all over it. I mean, Hawley, Marjorie Taylor Greene, all these people, like it's a hard sell to not say that. I mean, I know that's probably not necessarily true, but the narrative messaging isn't helping that perception. Let me put it that way.
Well, I am of the opinion people should be allowed to believe what they want to believe, and I should have the right to, believe what I want to believe. And
we also live in a pluralistic country with a variety of people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And it seems to me that today's Republican Party is not okay with that. They would like to go back to a country where the minorities stay quiet and white people are in charge. And that's the way it should always be.
Who was the party that tried to block civil rights in the 1960s?
Yes, I
Who
know
was
Southern Democrats who were unhappy. Yes, I know. But we also know there's been a political realignment on these issues.
not
Thanks to Nixon and the
entirely,
Southern Strategy in 1972.
not entirely has it realigned. You had good old Robert Byrd, who didn't realign, and Hillary was a buddy of his. So, one could still say there's elements of the Democrat Party that, if you look at what they are doing to minorities today, and we're talking white Democrats, the antics that they're doing today does not help a lot of what the minorities are wanting. I mean, frankly, some of the policies is like saying to minorities, we know best. You are not capable of taking care of yourself. So we're going to make all these laws that will protect you because you're incapable of making a good decision. So we'll take care of you. And I find that awful. I think if Democrats want to claim the high road, they need to be passing laws that actively encourage minorities to be able to be self-sufficient, be able to be in their own communities, and be able to be leaders in their own communities. And if they want to go back to segregation, so be it. I think their ancestors would roll over in their graves, because that's hardly equality if you're going back to segregating. But I'm okay with that, because you know what? I don't want to go live up in Minneapolis with the Muslim population up there and have to be in a burqa. And that is the problem with what the Democrats, in my view, have done. And some Republicans, I'm not going to disagree that the Republicans have their flaws as well. But the laws are not being made to encourage minorities to have the flexibility to be able to achieve their goals. There are white Democrats out there telling them this is what your goals should be. And that, to me, is not being respectful of minorities. Minorities shouldn't need white people to make laws to protect them. And minorities, should be given the flexibility to achieve the goals they want to achieve. And I don't see the Republicans or the Democrats passing laws that allow that. So frankly, I think both parties are being somewhat oppressive about the whole thing. And they're using emotionalism to try to make themselves each good guys.
I mean, there is definitely such a thing as, there's too many people at the Black Lives Matter protests sort of thing. Like, that's definitely a thing for sure. But anyway, this was supposed to be an hour and we've done almost 2. So why don't we wrap things up?
Sounds good.
My last question was, you have had some vaccine hesitancy. Are you still hesitant about the vaccine?
Yeah. I see pluses and minuses to it. I am of the opinion that governments need to leave people alone. If you choose to get vaccinated, then great. But now it's none of your business about the person who chooses not to get the vaccine. Because if you're vaccinated, you're protected. It shouldn't matter to you about the person that's not vaccinated. It is their job to be concerned about whether they're going to catch it. And instead, what we're getting is this peer pressure event of, if you don't get vaccinated, you're exposing me. And that's not right, because if you're vaccinated, you can't expose anybody to anything. So I'm not entirely appreciative of how it's being presented. And the side effects, whether anybody wants to admit it or not, people are having side effects. And too many people want to just blow that off and say, oh, it's no big deal. But to the people that it has affected, it's a big deal. And too many people that are pro-vaccination don't seem to care about that.
I
For
was
the most
definitely
part,
nervous because, like, with the flu vaccine, I always get flu-like symptoms, and because I have asthma, that ends up being a 6 week to 3 month problem. And from the first shot, I did get a lovely chest infection. Second shot was nothing. So yeah, I think those concerns need to be taken seriously.
but the biggest thing is people need to quit throwing their gauntlets out there saying, well, I can't come back to work unless everyone's vaccinated. As long as, according to the CDC and the WHO and everybody else, as long as you're vaccinated, you shouldn't care about whether the other person's vaccinated or not, because you're protected. And people are so obsessed about this, they can't let it go. They can't allow other people to have control of their lives. They are determined to force everybody to have to come to their way of thinking. And that is not a good thing for anybody, because when everybody's thinking the same way, nothing will grow, nothing will improve, nothing will get better, because everybody thinks the same because they're afraid to think different. And when you take that away, you're never going to get leaps in technology, leaps in medicine, because people are going to be afraid to express different ideas. And we see that already with the vaccines. We see that with medical journals. We are seeing so many people, quieted or silenced because too many people believe it's got to be one way or not at all. And the vaccine just has made that worse.
Indeed. What do you think is the biggest difference in politics between 1976 and today?
Are we talking about Joe Biden today and Jimmy Carter, or just in general?
Well, like in general, it's like your like in terms of presidential elections, your political life has spanned almost 50 years, 46 years. What do you think, like, given like political environments and the parties and all that type of thing, what do you think is the biggest difference between your first presidential election and your most recent presidential election?
I find my first presidential election, I had a lot of hope that my vote would matter. And now, after this last election and all the controversy, even with Gore and Bush, from Gore and Bush forward, I don't believe in the elections anymore.
I mean, you
vote in
voted
them.
third party a lot.
I do. I still vote in them, but I no longer believe that my vote matters. And I think that's the tragedy out of all of this, is that with the controversy of the voting and how the votes were counted, or how the ballots were tallied, I think that I'm not alone in that I don't believe in the system anymore. I think it doesn't matter. I believe that technology has made my vote irrelevant.
But doesn't the election of Donald Trump kind of disprove that, though?
Did what now?
The election of Donald Trump kind of, I mean, I don't think anyone expected Trump to win. I don't think Trump expected to win. I think he did it as a marketing stunt, as kind of a vanity project that kind of shows that votes matter. Enough people that live in the right states got together and decided they wanted a radical change, and they got it for 4 years.
That, I think, you might have a point there, but I think that was before all the new voting laws have come in, for better or worse, for Democrat or Republican. The federalization of motor voter with same-day registration, the desire not to have to prove you're a citizen for your vote, takes away the value of the vote. Because people who don't have a vested interest in the country voting, if there's a significant block of them, they can change the outcome. And I don't believe my vote matters because of the idea that everybody should vote, whether you're a citizen or not. Everybody should vote. And I believe that it should be citizens. And if citizens have to prove up with a driver's license to go into a bar, or you have to prove up with the driver's license to go to a doctor, or you have to prove up with the driver's license to pay a bill online, I frankly do not understand why it is so offensive to require some sort of formal identification to vote and prove that you're allowed as a citizen, that you are a citizen, and be allowed to vote. And as I said previously, I think that dilutes the citizens' vote, and I don't think my vote particularly counts, because as Obama proved, you can round up a lot of people, whether they're actual actual citizens or not. If you can round them up and get them all to the voting place, you can win an election of that nature. And I think that they showed that people that are not necessarily citizens can make a big difference.
Well, this has been an interesting tour of all these we have done like 50 years of American electoral history in 2 hours, which I think is fascinating from the perspective of somebody who was there. So thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Normally, this is the part of the show when we would do plugs, but you don't do social media, so there's nothing to plug.
That's true. I don't. I just, I refuse to get caught up in that because, again, I keep hearing the preaching about misinformation, and social media does a lot of misinformation.
So yes, well, if you have,
from it.
Yes, well, if the listener has questions and feedback or whatever for my mom, mention me on social media, and I will forward the questions along. So thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
You're welcome.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.